Welcome to you all. I'm Claire Wintle. I'm an academic at the University of Brighton, so on behalf of all Brightonians, I'm absolutely delighted to have you all here with us today. Welcome to the session on new skills and opportunities for world cultures curating. So far in the conference, we've had some really interesting provocations and debates about what could be next for the post-colonial museum. So thinking about the challenges of our contemporary position at the moment, the importance of decolonizing the museum as a phrase has been repeated on many occasions. We've been thinking about how museums might position themselves in relation to conflict, Englishness, in relation to their African collections. But right now, what I hope that we can do is identify and reflect on some of the skills and the resources that we might need to do those things effectively. And the idea for this panel really came from discussions with the co-organizer of this panel, my friend Helen Mears, who's sitting on the front row there, Helen's Keeper of World Art at Royal Pavilion and Museums Brighton and Hove, but at the time she was working on a secondment with me at the university, setting up a new course in curating collections and heritage. And we were thinking together with colleagues in the sector more broadly about what we want our students to learn, what they need to do this job. And we were asking ourselves, what were the skills, what were the behaviors that students need to work in these really exciting but also extremely demanding times as individuals. So one of the main aims of this session is to meet our amazing speakers, and I'll get to them in a moment, but also to create an ongoing discussion. So I think sometimes we have a lack of institutional and professional memory about some of the things that we've been doing for rather a long time. The idea is that we would like to use some of the collective discussions that come out of this session to write up a short report for the Museums Association, the Arts Council England, some of the SSNs that might have a particular stake in the issues that we're discussing today, like the Museum Ethnographers Group and the Islamic Art and Material Culture SSN, to set up a set of recommendations or requests for support in particular ways. So the plan for the session is that we're going to have 3 provocations from our speakers. We've got Christo Kefalas, who's the World Cultures Curator at the National Trust. She has a specialism in oceanic collections and a PhD in that from the University of Oxford. And she has also did some amazing work at the Horniman Museum, setting up the new World Gallery there. We also have Rachael, who is the Curator of Anthropology, particularly working on social practice and community engagement at the Horniman Museum and Gardens, also an amazing artist, and currently on the Museums Association's Board of Trustees, and previously she worked, amongst many other things, on the Past Is Now exhibition at the Birmingham Museum. And finally, last but not least, we have Rebecca Bridgman, who's Curatorial and Exhibitions Manager at Birmingham Museums, where she's specialised in Middle East and South Asian arts, but she's also the chair of the SSN for the Islamic Art and Material Culture. So I'm really very grateful for these people who are extremely busy to come and talk to us about their practice and offer some suggestions for where they think what the key skills and behaviours are that we might need to develop collectively as a community of people who work with world cultures collections. So they've been kind of tasked with answering 3 questions. What are those key skills and behaviours? What are the current barriers preventing individual and institutional change? And what are your recommendations going forwards? And the idea is that they suggest some of those things, and then I'm going to make you move and talk to each other in small groups to ask those questions yourself, but also to draw up perhaps 3 per group, key recommendations, and then they will be fed back from the facilitators that we've got planted around the room who are going to pop up at an opportune moment. And then the idea is that there will be some kind of report that we will share with you as a draft, and then in its final version as well, so that we can move these questions forwards in sustainable and productive ways as well that are properly resourced. So I'm really delighted to welcome Christo. Thanks very much.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Is this mic on? No? Should I move closer over here, perhaps? Hello? Hello. Okay. Is this on now? Okay, perfect. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christo, and I'm the World Cultures Curator for the National Trust. I'm going to be keeping my reflections and my discussion of my projects that I'm working on quite brief today. I'm hoping that through these discussions that we'll be able to all talk to each other and that we'll all be able to provide some additional depth to my initial thoughts and ideas about how we can move our practice forward in the future. Now, I'm working in a slightly different context than some of my colleagues on the stage today because the National Trust is an independent charity, and we have responsibilities over the conservation of land, coastline, heritage sites, archaeological sites, as well as historic houses. And the historic houses include collections that you might traditionally think that a curator might have responsibility over. Curators, as the Trust, have a responsibility and duty of care for all aspects of the heritage assets that we work with, from collaboratively making decisions and plans for exciting exhibitions to the not-so-glamorous planning of our never-ending cafe refurbishments. This is the kind of variety of responsibility that brings to the fore one of the more universal characteristics of a curation skill set. Our responsibility is to research, interpret, and communicate the stories of the places and collections we care for in a way that respects their plural and layered histories. In the context of world cultures, there's an inherited responsibility of care, which is deeply political and demands a sense of social consciousness, while we work as the intermediaries between an institution, which likely has complex colonial histories, and communities who have inherited the repercussions of the traumatic histories associated with collections. By way of a very brief introduction to one of the key projects I'm working on with the Trust, I'm showing you an image of Henna Mihi, the Maori meeting house which sits in the gardens of Clarendon Park in Surrey. The National Trust obtained Clarendon Park in 1956, and at that point, Henna Mihi had been sited at Clarendon since 1892. After she was purchased by the 4th Earl of Onslow after his tenure as Governor of New Zealand. As a Maori meeting house, Henna Mihi is considered a living being and is the embodiment of Henna Mihi, the ancestress of the Ngāti Henna Mihi Maori community. Therefore, we always refer to Henna Mihi as a she. The project that I'm working on is one that includes quite extensive public and source community consultation to think through how we might restore and improve Henna Mihi's condition and wide-ranging community uses at Clarendon Park. Since the catastrophic fire, which burnt down most of the main house at Clarendon Park in 2015, there's been a refocusing around how we at the Trust should improve the use and function of the meeting house, which survived from the fire untouched. The carvings are some of the oldest existing in meeting house form, and therefore we have an extensive conservation project underway, while we're also thinking through how we might relocate her at Clarendon and reinterpret her living story. And I'm keeping this project description quite brief in order to keep to time, but I want to illuminate some of the key behaviors that this has enabled me as a curator to take on as part of my work. The decisions that we're thinking through for Henna Mihi demand an engagement with source community and diaspora Maori communities from New Zealand, which means we're navigating issues of collections ownership, access, and our own personal demands of emotional resilience for all of those involved in the projects. As curators, our engagement with individuals and community groups sets us on a two-way advocacy path between the external individuals we work with as well as our organization. And as storytellers, the work that we do goes beyond investigations into the archival evidence to explore history and instead engages the perspectives of the living communities who have their stake in their public representations and must be participants in the experiences we create for wider audiences. Now, working with collections acquired in colonial or otherwise coercive interactions means that the trauma and emotion of these interactions is transposed onto the collection histories and communities that we directly interact with as curators. This emotional affect isn't something that we should shy away from, and leaning into the vulnerability and exposure we feel as intermediaries upholding institutional integrity with the people that we work with is very important. Now, moving swiftly on to barriers, and I really wanted to bring to the fore that one of our major barriers is the barrier that we have of language and terminology. And I think specifically at the Trust and perhaps lesser so in other organizations, we aren't always equipped at this level to expose individuals or groups to the way our collections are labeled and described. This can at times increase a sense of dissociation from our collections. And beyond that, as world cultures curators, we're often working with communities for whom English is a second language. And there's a need to find an additional resource, an additional support for people, especially when we aren't equipped with the right level of linguistic or cultural nuance to carry out these research and display projects. And now there's another barrier here, which is specifically about access. And I think that's both intellectual and physical access. Specifically, in the physical access sense for the Henna Mihi project, we've recognized that we need to work with the diaspora Maori community in the UK because Henna Mihi's carvings create that sense of connection to place that individuals want. And we want to maintain that access to her while she's undergoing the conservation work that respects reciprocal relationships that we're trying to maintain. The main caveat to this, of course, being that we don't have a collections management team in the traditional sense, in which their remit might be to actually enable this access to collections. This, coupled with the fact that most of the Maori community who want access to Henna Mihi, of course, want access to Henna Mihi on Saturdays, which makes complete sense in terms of need, but it demands quite a serious personal commitment for the few individuals who are involved in the project that we're undertaking. So some recommendations that we're thinking about, and that I'm sure we'll all elaborate on as we go further, is I think if we want to become a place of dialogue and embrace an internal learning culture for ourselves, we have to be brave when facing sensitive issues and be very open to challenge. But at a strategic level, what this really means is that we would really benefit from having interpretation and inclusion guidance from museum sector regulators that brings together the wealth of information and learnings from projects across the sector. Another key part of exhibition and research projects is the need for intellectual, visible, and resource legacy. As curators, we're seeking to operate with reciprocity and in genuine partnership of the relationships we're trying to establish. So there's a need for resources to support return visits, exchanges of information, and communications in the future. As advocates for both communities and our museums, an ethos of sharing knowledge and engendering greater understanding must underpin our work. We want to be very relevant, but that also means we have to have sustainable outcomes. Thank you.
And is my mic on? Yes, excellent. Just wait for my slides to come up. That was amazing and really interesting, and I'm quite intimidated to follow you. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited for an opportunity to take part in something that should be a really practically focused session, and I really hope my contribution will be both useful but provocative. I'm going to be more general and respond directly to the 3 questions that were posed to us, and exploring how social practice can be embedded into collaboration through curatorial work and how decolonial theory can inform this kind of critical discourse. For me, decolonial work is fundamentally human-centered practice. It challenges ideas of neutrality, authority, and tries to create multiplicity of perspectives and voices. As such, decolonial work, for me, is collaborative, public-facing, transparent, while being challenging and critical. So the key skills that world curators need to conduct this sort of work is the ability, first, to explore context beyond our specialism. Ask, how does this work that we are doing fit into the wider discourse, academically, in the sector, politically, in pop culture, global histories? So for example, how does the work that we do with Caribbean communities fit into the context of doing this sort of work with ongoing Windrush scandal? How does the work with African collections read after the SAR Savoy report? How is it perceived publicly after Black Panther's success? The key skills is to understand how we can use these contexts to strengthen our practice. Are we able to ask more critical questions? Are you able to explore more complex connections? Because there are pop cultural references now that mean that we don't need to start from zero. Can you platform emotional depth and lived experiences now in a way that it is valued equally to academic and specialist training, for example? The second skill I've identified is the ability to unpack our practice into key steps, being able to demonstrate how we make decisions that are instinctive, especially if these decisions may be problematic and informed by subconscious biases or limited perspectives. These include, how do we make long and short lists of objects from our databases? How do we show what information we use as selection criteria? At what stage do we imagine these items together? How does it affect our choices going forward? And what do we leave out and why? What sort of object information do we make public and when? And then finally, at the skills, being able to let go of creative and intellectual control / quality control. So asking, why are we doing this project? Is the outcome a shiny professional-looking exhibition? If so, why? If it doesn't need to be does it need to be quality controlled? Whose voices are we privileging and why? And whose / what form of knowledge are we valuing? So reflecting on these skills, I wanted to question the barriers that were happening, why we weren't necessarily putting these skills into practice. So I think the most relevant barrier is this idea of risk and this feeling of risk aversion. We can become really concerned with reputational risk as institutions, but also as individuals, and as such feel the need to hold on to control to ensure that there's some quality outcomes. The quality control also ensures that we're considering visitors beyond our collaborators. And then there is the economic risk. How did we spend the money that we were granted? How are we spending public funds? What is the quantitative output and outcome? Do these projects make us less or more economically resilient? And another barrier is deciding and communicating whose contexts are we using. Many view museums as neutral, and many do not. But the expectations need to be managed in both cases by being open, discursive, and honest about the limitations of positionalities that we have chosen. When conducting collaborative projects, our perspectives or expertise might be at odds with that being communicated. So what happens when we disagree with our collaborators? We must acknowledge that we and the institutions we represent are participants, not just facilitators in these collaborations. And if we are privileging contexts outside of the expertise held in the institutions, funding and fair remuneration for the expertise might be a barrier faced to ethically conducting this work. Which brings me neatly onto my final barrier that I'll mention today, which is diversity in the workforce. So working in anthropology or ethnography or world cultures departments can feel very violent if you're not a part of the dominant narrative. You will experience a strange self-othering, particularly when you're entering into discussions about outreach or access or diversity, where the discussions of the we that you belong to as an institution isn't actually how you identify as an individual. Otherwise, there's this risk of self-objectification, so you step into this role of representing your race, sexuality, age, disability, etc. And these are really violent interactions and actions that need to be addressed, among other things, if we are to get a representative workforce in the sector. So looking up some damaging information for charity sector as a whole, you can check out the charity so white hashtag. There's a lot of interesting kind of case studies and responses there. This is essentially an essential barrier to tackle because the lack of diversity in the sector is in direct correlation to a lack of trust in managing world cultures. And I don't know how our discipline can or should survive if this isn't addressed. And so my recommendations are as follows. Do collaboratively create rules of engagement. This clarity is really important throughout any collaborative project. Strive for multiplicity, so not representation in narratives. The latter is futile, you'll never represent everybody. But the first kind of encourages this critical engagement. Create project budgets with fair remuneration and expertise embedded at the beginning. Think about it afterwards. And then I would suggest that you think of yourself as players, not the player. So if you need to make your case within the group, that you do so in the same way that you're expecting your participants to make their cases. This is the part where you are now valuing work experience, lived experience, and academic experience equally. And then finally,
The National Theatre has declared a climate of ecological emergency and is ending its sponsorship with Shell.
woo! And just my final one, which is just think of museums as sharing spaces. We're not necessarily teaching spaces. There's no right answer. There's more narratives. Thank you.
Have you got my slides at the back?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So thanks very much for the invite to speak today. So I'm going to answer the questions both from a personal perspective, but also that of a museum professional working in a regional museum, with a bit of reference to cuckoos and elephants. So bear with me on this if you're a bit confused. So in relation to curating world cultures, I am a bit of a cuckoo in a nest within this group, because my area of expertise is Islamic art and archaeology, which is not always included in the standard definition of world cultures, which are often equated with ethnographic collections. But those definitions are changing and broadening, especially in the context of regional museums, as curatorial teams shrink and those remaining have to broaden their remits. In relation to world cultures, this often means staff are covering collections relating to anywhere outside of Europe, overlapping with archaeology, Egyptology, modern contemporary art, decorative art, and social history. So this slide gives you a bit of an insight into what could be considered world cultures from Birmingham's collections. So in terms of skills, curators have to be the very definition of somebody with T-shaped skills, perhaps with an original area of specialism, but able to flex and expand over a much wider scope. But with definitions of world cultures broadening, delivering any level of detailed research on those collections can seem a near impossible dream. And in turn, creating new cutting-edge and engaging displays can be difficult, while considering inquiries in relation to restitution and repatriation, for example, can be a huge pressure. So co-curation and co-production can help us answer and address this vast geographical and chronological span of collections and empower audiences to take ownership of them. So it goes without saying, really, that world cultures curators need to be highly skilled in socially engaged practice, capable of reaching outside the bubble of their own life experience and connecting with people sometimes very different to themselves. In this context, world cultures collections are often seen as the answer to ACE's creative case for diversity, used as a tool to reach out to new and diverse audiences, basically some of the people least likely to come to museums. At Birmingham, curators working with world cultures collections have, alongside learning teams, delivered a wide range of co-curated displays. For example, Faith in Birmingham, that you can see here, where I learned to value audience interpretation and learned how to listen, I think, more importantly, and work collaboratively to create new meanings. And also The Past Is Now that Rachael and I worked on together, which taught me that decolonising is contextualising and that interpretation is rarely anywhere close to neutral. So with that focused on socially engaged practice, now on to the barriers. And the elephants. I haven't forgotten about the elephants. So the elephant in the room. Of course, there are many barriers, and my colleagues here have already raised a number of them, but the one I want to raise is that I'm a white British curator working with world cultures collections. In my experience, a white world cultures collections curator must acknowledge and grapple with the obvious elephant in the room and not try to brush it under the carpet. There must be a recognition that, in inverted commas, I was there and so you are here, and how this might impact on the power dynamics of any collaborative project. Certainly, there is no doubt that at an institutional level, we must find ways to diversify the workforce further, as Rachael has already talked about. But returning to the individual, on the ground at the moment, white curators are curating world cultures collections up and down the country, and they're sometimes afraid to work with elements of those collections. For example, a survey of members of the SSN for Islamic art has revealed a significant shortfall in professional confidence of staff in this area. The result is that those collections sometimes languish in the stores because staff are afraid to make a mistake, write a label that might be at best wrong, or at worst offensive, or even racist, sort of referring back to Rachael's categories of risk. So what shines through for me in all of this is curatorial and subject specialist knowledge, a knowledge that is being lost, and that we are losing as curatorial teams shrink. So my recommendation would be to value this knowledge. It helps contextualize collections and provides one of the many meanings that can be woven together to form socially engaged practice. So here I get to give an unashamed plug for the Subject Specialist Network for Islamic Art and Material Culture. This slide has just a few images and stats. Like other SSNs, including the Museum Ethnographers Group, we help regional museums help themselves by providing training and expertise. It's a crucial time for the development of those subject specialist networks. Their importance in supporting regionals in particular has been recognised, but currently the path forward for their future is not entirely clear. I think there is a need for a strategic approach and direction, but also a need for curators and other museum staff to get involved, not only taking advantage of the training, but also stepping up to help the running of those SSNs. SSNs are not the only answer, but they're certainly a big part of the equation that should include more balanced relationships with academics and museums, and plugging into networks and opportunities, for example, those with the British Council. But it's only through these and other initiatives that we can help museum staff working with world cultures collections unlock the potential of those collections, which in the context of 21st century Britain has never been so important in breaking down barriers of misunderstanding and bringing people and communities together who might otherwise see themselves as very different. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really thoughtful, thought-provoking, but also very practical suggestions for what we might do. Our original intention had been to be in a slightly more convivial environment with round tables, but we were placed here, and that's okay. We can work with that. There's more people here too, which is great, but I think the best thing to do is to maybe kind of cluster a little bit, and we're going to give out these whiteboards so that you can record some of the notes that you're having together in small clusters, and then if somebody can report back from each kind of community of curators, and then Helen will try and have a go at summarising some of our thoughts at the end. But I think it's really important to record what we're saying today so that we can take some of this forward. But you're also experts in awkward buildings. You work in museums, which are never handy. So you can do this. I have every faith. So if you can kind of just cluster in small groups, and we'll deliver these things out.
Okay, everybody. It's really exciting to see people actually talking to each other in this space. But I'm going to have to break it up. But I hope that this is a useful space to start that dialogue and that we can continue those discussions later. But it'd be really nice to do some reporting back now so that people can share their kind of key priorities at this stage. So should we start at the back with the gobby lot? Bryony, are you responding to... do you want to represent your group, or is there somebody else who wants to speak? Can we have a microphone over there as well?
Hi, yeah, for number one, we were talking about the fact that it's looking at the skills of not just curators, but of all museum staff within the institutions, and also we were really looking at the term world cultures. Is it world culture collections, or is it actually all cultures, all cultural collections, if you like, that material culture of museums is what we're talking about? And is the word world problematic in terms of referring to other through this supposedly inclusive word? So we discussed that a lot. We talked about the needs in terms of skills to acknowledge our own subjectivities and to have a sense of humility, that there's often this tension between the expert knowledge within the museum and the whatever other knowledge there is externally, and that we need to look at bringing those two together and levelling those the perceptions of that knowledge. Listening, and a really important key skill. How can we be humble experts. And in terms of communication, we have to think about language, how language changes and evolves, and how do we consult and use our listening skills to get to a shared language that is not problematic for all. We talked around number one quite a lot, so that's our main points, really.
I think that was very, very good. It's fine. Great. Okay. Does the next group want to nominate a spokesperson? Sorry.
Hello. Okay. We also very much focused around the skills and behaviors that we saw as quite important to world cultures curating, and quite a lot of the conversation was around also how you might build up those skills and what you might do in terms of unconscious bias training, and how you can make people more aware, not just within the curatorial profession, but I think just within the museum in general, about how these different kinds of biases might affect the way that you practice or the way that you interact with individuals. And also we talked a lot about how the practice itself is really about how we make connections with people. And obviously that's not just with the people that you might work with to interpret those collections, but also the people that we have coming in as audiences. And you need to be able to have that sense of what is it that develops that level of connectivity. An idea that we aren't, of course, just the sole experts, and the idea that we're really there to be sharing expertise rather than just owning the expertise, and that we are obviously gaining as much from people who may not traditionally be within that field of experts that you get that label for, but that everybody is learning from each other. There was obviously quite a lot of focus from our side, at least, about that it would be quite useful for institutions to have a range of training. I mentioned unconscious bias, but also conflict training and negotiation skills, as well as sensitivity training, which is something that I know is in place at National Maritime Museum and has apparently worked quite well for them. And I think developing something along those lines for, again, all museum staff, not just museum curators, would be helpful. I think an awareness of the fact that we want to be plain speaking, but also that we just need to be aware of the language that we use, and language changes, language evolves. And in order to engage with people in the 21st century, we need to kind of have that level of, that skill set of how you can actually speak to people, how you communicate. In terms of other kind of recommendations going forward, I think understanding equalities legislation came up, and the idea of a greater understanding of the ethics around museums and museum curation, as well as the idea of SSNs, which is really important. And of course, in this context, I think Museum Ethnographers Group is a great example, because it's a great forum of knowledge and a network that can help provide, I think, a touch point for a lot of people. But then just on a personal note, I think a lot of things many people mention in this group is this idea about resilience and emotional resilience, and the fact that individuals really need to have a sense of personal and emotional resilience when you're doing this kind of work. I think that's a really difficult thing to find, but I think the people obviously who thrive the most are the ones who can have that and develop that. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Should we move down the room?
So we had the language came up, discussion of language came up in our group, and we actually had a recommendation based on, more conversations around language usage and what language, how language would work for different cultures. So perhaps a network based on something a colleague just highlighted. In Manchester, there's a carbon literacy training network for organizations to discuss what carbon literacy is. So perhaps a museum network which would enable those conversations to take place and really think collectively around how language would work, particularly in a context where label interpretation, label information interpretation, are crucial spaces where those actions could happen. Another important one was at trustee level in organizations. It would be very interesting and important perhaps to have, if that doesn't happen already, to have world cultures experts who can enable policy making and really thinking about resources needed for certain kinds of practices that should take place in organizations. And the third recommendation, actually, it has a few points within that overarching theme of workforce. Often in museums, the workforce really privileges individuals who come from heritage or particular academic backgrounds with a requirement for MAs and particular kinds of knowledge. And UK-based degrees are privileged, whereas there are so many volunteers working in our museums who have a lot of different kinds of knowledge, lived experiences, but also degrees from other parts of the world, and interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary expertise, and to really think about who is working in these spaces. And so lots of people, not just heritage, was a sentence I sort of wrote down that a colleague mentioned here. And better training for staff to undertake world cultures collecting work.
Great. And I should just say thank you to Meg Haraj Guru, my lovely colleague from the University of Brighton, who's come specially to facilitate this session. So thank you, Meg.
Thanks.
Okay, great. Can we...
Lots of things that came up that tally with things that have been said already. So we spoke in relation to key skills. We spoke about listening and collaboration, about humility, about the feedback loop of knowledge creation, that's a two-way flow. And in particular, the curators need to develop the confidence to work with external stakeholders. And again, that's a two-way flow. And someone said it's not a skill, it's an approach. So this is a set of approaches, a sort of skill set. In relation to current barriers, we talked a little bit about the courage to address issues that are sort of pertinent to world cultures collections, particularly in contexts where perhaps those are orphaned collections, the complexity of collections histories and concern and sort of stress around questions of redress and repatriation. We spoke very briefly about the worry that sometimes SSNs and academic specialist knowledge can be silos of knowledge, and that world cultures collections are all collections. So this spreads right across all museums and all collections, and that while it's important that specialist subject networks and those kind of specialist organizations have these discussions, that needs to be shared with the wider sector. In relation to that and recommendations moving forward, we spoke a little bit about new models of recruitment that need to balance sets of sort of museum practice, community engagement, public engagement, alongside specialist academic knowledge, so recruitment, particularly in National Museum contexts where there are specialist subject curators still, that's a challenge and a balancing act. And within those conversations about sort of sharing of knowledge, we need advice and sharing of case studies about people who've been willing to deconstruct their academic and specialist knowledge and reconstruct it in light of those community conversations. So really good, strong case studies that we can share and learn from. In relation to that, we spoke very briefly towards the end about respecting expertise, in particular external stakeholder expertise. I put a pound sign and a euro sign there, but obviously that should have lots of currencies because we're talking in a global context. And then finally, we need curators who are willing to work on weekends, like I'll be doing tomorrow. So more people are willing to give up their weekends and consider that sort of balance with the wider public.
Thank you very much. Do you want to say a little?
So a lot of the stuff that we discussed has already come up, particularly around openness and being willing to engage, whether that's with other communities or other people within the sector or even just your audiences. And then also being a good listener and able to receive criticism but not take it personally. So having a sort of self-reflective practice. It's one of the examples was mentioned about how not have something might have been stored incorrectly 30 or 40 years ago, but that's not necessarily your fault, but you can change it going forward. And then in terms of, we also sort of discussed dialogue as well, and conversation and discussion. In terms of the second question, provocation, we talked about resources being a barrier because museums are understaffed and underfunded, and that was an issue around having enough people, enough time and enough money, the perennial problem. And then the other barrier that we identified was that the definition of world cultures is a bit of a problem, and that is perhaps something that we could build upon from.
It's really good to have a sense of the recurring discussions that have happened around the room, but I'm also slightly concerned that we're running out of time. So if there are new things that haven't been added to the debate already, that would be really fantastic. Sorry to rush you.
So one of the key things that we picked out in terms of that was listening to everybody in your institution, from front of house and retail and the cafe staff right up to the very top. And that's the one that I wanted to introduce. It's the newer one, just to wrap it up.
Last but not least.
I seem to have the microphone because I've got the pen. I think the only thing that we would add to what's already been said is the ability to give up the power, which I just tried to do, and people told me to have the microphone anyway. Identify sources of help, which can include universities. Don't assume you know it all. Under barriers, I actually insisted on writing down one of the barriers is the need to make exhibitions shiny. Because I think one of the recommendations could be that if you actually make them less shiny, then it leaves you open that when people come in and say, actually, I'd like you to adjust that or change it, it's a lot easier to do it. And I suppose the other barrier we had was bad attitudes, which includes attitudes of staff to any changes you're trying to make, and a recommendation about explaining the reasons for any changes that you're making. And I do like the best one, which is actually the recommendation which says, just do it.
Not branded by Nike. We're against capitalism in this conference. Fantastic, thank you. Can I introduce Helen Mears, who's going to make it all sense?
Just in the last couple of minutes, I'm going to try and draw out some themes that I've heard both from our speakers and from the participants here. I think it's been really interesting hearing collections talked about a lot more in the last two sessions, collections and collections knowledge, something that sort of have occupied a slightly ambivalent status in some of the other discussions we've been having. But the question of what is the role of collections knowledge? It's both problematic, who has it, who doesn't have it, but also is clearly absolutely fundamental to progressing some of the radical progressive work that we as institutions, as curators and collection staff need to do. But I was interested in the term humble experts. So we still need to have knowledge, but we need to be more humble and reflexive about where we acquire that knowledge, how we acquire that knowledge. In terms of skills, the skills of advocacy, of listening, of embracing critique, of welcoming critical friendships, I think came out.